A storm is brewing in Africa, and it's the third-term presidential obsession. Many African leaders have come under the spotlight for their undemocratic, thirst for third term in office. For the same thing has caused quite a number of pain in redefining what democracy means for the continent. Cameroon's Paul Biya has been in office since 1982, and of course without any term limit. That's our conversation today on Village Square as we unearth this insatiable thirst for governance. Well, that's a big one happening on the continent, whether it's unwanted, unwarranted, forced, or perhaps deserving. African presidents haven't actually done pretty well seeking beyond the term limits in countries. In recent months, Guinea's Alpha Condé and Ivorian President Alassane Ouattara have both returned to offices for a third term and twisting their nation's constitutions to favor their move. Ouattara specifically said the death of his chosen successor warranted his choice to become president again. Now, bloodshed, carnage, all manners of trouble we're seeing in their imagines, but it looks as though the lives of the people don't mean a thing in the face of their agenda. So joining me today on Village Square to discuss this issue is Collins Nweke. He's a global affairs analyst. Good to have you join me, Collins, on this all-important discussion. And of course, Adeniyi Kunnu, an African affairs analyst, is also with us on the show. Gentlemen, good to have you both on VSA. Now, quickly looking at what we're dealing with today, the third-term presidency. Perhaps let's start with you, Collins. Is this a kind of obsession to African leaders, and what could be the reasons for this? Because time was when in the 80s that seemed to be the fad, but now we're still seeing this at the moment, especially what we've seen in Alassane Ouattara and Alpha Condé.
Well, thank you first and foremost for having me, and compliments of the season to yourself and to your viewers. Well, I think there are very good reasons to actually draw the conclusion indeed that there is some sort of obsession with African leaders in terms of tenure elongation. And now I want to make it clear from the onset that, I'm rather indifferent about term limit or, unlimited term limits. I mean, there are some, downside to it, and there are some also positive sides, But of course, I think the issue has always been the way and manner in which countries or leaders that decide to go for term limits, how they go about it, in terms of moving away from term limits to unlimited, tenure of office. So I think it has more to do with undemocratic dispositions of these leaders when they go about it, and not necessarily the whole concept of unlimited term of office.
Let me bring in Adeniyi here. When you take a look at the kind of instruments used by these leaders, you see referenda, removal of age limits, term limits, and other constitutional tweaks. How culpable is the judiciary and legislature in this problem?
Well, Sulaiman, I'd have to tell you that you've taken me to where I was heading for, and it brings me to Uganda, where you have Yoweri Museveni. Yoweri Museveni actually should not have had the opportunity to continue his term in office or to elongate his stay in office, but it was aided by the parliament that actually removed that age clause. And I tell you, if you left there and went to Ivory Coast, you'd agree with me also that Alassane Ouattara should have rounded off and left, but all of the things they do in adjusting the rule books continue to keep them there. Alpha Condé is 82. If you look at Paul Biya of Cameroon, he's over 80 years. Somebody would have told me that, oh, accommodate. If you look at the US, you have a Joe Biden going to 80, you have a Donald Trump over 70. But these people have not exceeded the term limit of the constitutions of their country. So it is quite the reverse in Africa. And so I need to tell you this, that we cannot divorce the bigger hand of France in the happenings in the respective country, and of course the toothless nature of the African Union. When I talk about France, for instance, I need to say this. In the entire Francophone Africa, Sulai, every country colonized by Africa must give France the right of refusal of every new mineral or solid minerals or resources found on their continent. Every of the monies of this African country is deposited in the French central bank, and they need an approval not to exceed a certain percentage withdrawal. So we're talking about France that has kept these Francophone countries in bondage. For instance, let me tell you this. In 2019, July, a lot of African countries, especially ECOWAS region, agreed to have the ECO currency. Months after, we found that Côte d'Ivoire announced alongside a number of other African countries that it is staying with the French francs against what was agreed by the bloc. That is talking about the West African region. It tells you that these things you see often happen in Francophone Africa. If you check Anglophone Africa, I can tell you that to a great extent, it is manageable. It is worse off in Francophone Africa. I have to say that Africa, particularly the African Union, by the reason of this despot, must begin to reinvent itself and cut off everything that makes it remain stooge to the colonialists. And that is what we have here. So if you look at the country in focus, Guinea, you look at Ivory Coast, it is simply that they are still tied to the apron strings of the colonial lords.
Let me bring in Collins here, who's got a different view from yours. He says, well, he's not particular about the term limit, but perhaps maybe his key concern is about, what these countries have been able to put in place, as their own democratic principles. Collins, let's speak more to your views, which is quite different from what Adeniyi holds and pretty much some other Africans watching this program. How would you have loved this to go for African countries who have actually gone beyond a two-term limit, which should cumulatively have been 8 years in office?
Yeah, well, I think it's very difficult to resist the temptation to, call a spade here in terms of naming some specific African countries. I mean, where I can avoid it, I will indeed try to avoid it and leave it as global as possible. But let me single out Nigeria for a start. Now, Chief Olusegun Obasanjo came to power in 1999, served his first term, did the second one, and towards the end of his second term of office, there were very visible signs of him attempting to, get the constitution adapted such that he could do a third term. Well, we all know today that Chief Olusegun Obasanjo didn't do a third term. And the reason he didn't do a third term was because, first and foremost, you had at the time a crop of, seasoned legislators who actually understood what that would have meant for Nigeria. They stood their ground and made sure that that attempt was decisively defeated. Now, you also had a populace that was at the time, democratically enlightened and very well exposed to the vagaries of democracy, that they were able to exercise sufficient pressure on the legislatures to ensure that the attempt or the alleged attempt was defeated. Now, I use the word alleged attempt because President Obasanjo has actually denied ever doing anything, and there is nothing to find on the records that he actually did it. Now, the point I'm trying to make about this is as follows. Voter education is very, very important because the populace are at the center of all of this. Now, if they have sufficient information and are electorally educated enough, they will be able to do what is necessary to, one, resist such attempt, but two, make a determination as to whether a president, irrespective of his age, irrespective of how long he has been in power, whether he is the one that is needed at that point or not.
So let me bring in Kunnu here. The good thing here is that you've said, well, it was, from the rumor mills, nothing pointing to the fact that President Obasanjo of Nigeria at that point in time did try to, sneak in the third term through the legislature, even though some members have alleged that he did, so. Now, Kunnu, now you said something about the Africans, wanting to stay in office, and you also tried to draw an analogy between the Anglophone African countries and the Francophone African countries. And one of the key countries we have mentioned on this show is Cameroon, whose president has been in office since 1982 with no term limits. So how does this work when it comes to, deepening democracy for such countries that have just, for instance, in the life of maybe many individuals have seen just one president for many years?
Okay, so let me first of all say that I need to clear the air on the third-term agenda for Obasanjo. There's nothing like allegation. Two things. In one of the write-ups following the third-term agenda of the former president, he said if anybody mentioned that there was no third-term agenda, he would contend with the person. But that if the third-term agenda came from him, then that is something he wouldn't agree. So for Obasanjo, it is not alleged. It's a reality. It's a fact of the matter.
That there was an attempt.
Agenda, there was an attempt to get, to stay in power for a third term. And don't also forget that one of his protege, talking about Ayodele Fayose, has said several times. In fact, there was a day he was about to break the calabash on all that transpired. And a number of TV stations that were carrying that particular live broadcast had to act as if there was a technical problem because they didn't want Nigerians to actually hear what transpired. So the reality remains that there was a third-term agenda. But as Collins Nweke said, Nigeria has a robust and very informed electorate coupled with the particular legislature that defied anything that contradicted democratic principles. Now, coming to the issue of what you're talking about, so let me tell you, it is practically impossible for democracy to be deepened on the African continent unless Africans arise to see that there is a common enemy to be fought. Let's say this. Haiti, the country in the Caribbean, stopped paying what is called, I think, the Haiti debt in 1947 that had been there since early 18th century. And why was that? Because Haiti fought against those that were trying to take over its country during the colonial era. And the French says, for us not to attack you again, you have to pay a certain amount of money. If you look at Burkina Faso today, it's another record that the French people were the criminals and the thieves that actually rendered Burkina Faso to what it is until they removed it. If you look at Mali again, why was Sankara killed? Because Sankara said, we are honorable people. Let's get the countries together to work for ourselves. So I think that Africa must first of all form a common front to lie, for them to realize the energies of the strength they have to fight a common enemy. There is nothing that happens on the African continent today, I stand not to be corrected here, that is not engineered by the colonial powers. Let me say this. Chombori Kwai was an African ambassador. She's now back in the United States of America. She was removed because of her opposition against France, and the toothless African leader that constituted the leadership of the African Union did not deem it fit to stand against France, because they felt she was revealing too much, and perhaps they've made themselves indebted and stooges to what? To these colonial powers, and not allowing it to happen. So Africa must form a common front. Then secondly, people like us that have the privilege of interaction at this level must also engage repeatedly so that we can conscientize Africans to understand they need to stand for themselves.
Let me bring in Collins here if he agrees with you, because you have just made some strong allegations, taking it off the plate of the African leaders to say that there is some puppet master, which you have called the colonial masters. They're the ones selling or whispering the whole idea and supporting these leaders, having to see that their overbearing force is, put on the people to accept them in office. Collins, do you agree with what Adeniyi has said?
The point is this. I think there are very strong indications that some invisible hands are pretty active in African politics, such that politics in Africa appears to serve the interests of people other than those citizens that are in Africa. And indeed, from a number of examples, that have not been contested, really incontestable examples, we do know indeed that, Western powers, France as an example, Switzerland used to be, some very nasty bully of the neighborhood. We know of the UK and a host of, other countries that have actually held Africa hostage. But one point is clear, and we need to emphasize that point. And that point is that there is no demand if there is no supply, and vice versa. So when you are battling the world leaders whose invisible hands continue to cause menace in Africa, you also need to hold the African leaders accountable. And I tell you one thing, you do this mainly by electoral education, like I mentioned previously, because ultimately this is all down to the Africans themselves. If I have the latitude, let me also mention that the regional powers, ECOWAS, AU, and the rest of them also have very, very important role to play here. I hope I have the opportunity later in the program.
No, definitely.
So
I think you'll find out opportunity. We'll take a moment. When we come back, we'll look at some of these areas that you would like to highlight, perhaps also give you a bird's eye view of the number of African leaders that have been, in office for many, many years, and ask if it is in the numbers or what they have turned the numbers into democratically or developmentally for the people. That's after now. Welcome back to VSA. Still having a conversation with Adeniyi Kunnu and Nweke. But now let's bring you up to some speed on African presidents who have actually done 3 terms and those that tried but failed. We have 78-years-old Alassane Ouattara in Ivory Coast, and he's been serving since 2010. Alpha Condé of Guinea, of course, the late Pierre Nkurunziza in Burundi served for 15 years. Idriss Déby of Chad is on his 29th years already. And now let's tell you about Paul Biya in Cameroon without term limit. Now, he's been president since 1982. Denis Sassou Nguesso of Congo, 1992 till date. In Nigeria, as highlighted by both of you, former President Olusegun Obasanjo did try but failed. He served as military head of state from 76 to 79 and later as president of Nigeria from 1999 to 2007. Paul Kagame, you can fail to put his name on the list. He serves for 20 years in Rwanda. Yoweri Museveni in Uganda has spent 34 years as president. Edgar Lungu, who's been Zambia's president since 2015. Ismail Omar, Djibouti, of course, Teodoro Obiang, Equatorial Guinea, and the list goes on. You know, let me bring in Kunnu here, Kunnu, because for some, they are asking the question, is it in the number of years or what these African leaders have done with the number of years they've been in office? If they're doing pretty well, would anyone be about the number of years you've been in office?
Well, Sulai, there is something fundamental here, and I'm aware you are also in cognizance of the expression, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, nobody at the same time has the monopoly of knowledge, and because human beings vary in ideas, that is why you find out that we don't have the same skin complexion, we do not have the same height, and for everybody with these different varieties of physiology, physiognomy, we find out that there's something unique about them. If you check power, for instance, the reason many wars are being fought is because at some point, some people attempted to lord over the other. Essentially, look at Nazi Germany. It felt it was superior to others, something that is usually tied to power. And before you know, it unleashes its dragon, where people, look at Serbia, for instance, look at the former Yugoslavia, I beg your pardon. Look at what Slobodan Milosevic did. Look at Rwanda here. It's about a group feeling superior to the other, and it's all tied to power. It's tied to dominance. The reason we cannot erase the fact that elongation of tenure. Look at Guinea, for instance. The constitution was amended. Yoweri Museveni, the constitution was amended. Even the Paul Kagame that people praise as the doyen of African development, they amended the constitution for him to remain there. Look at the madness in Cameroon, where you don't have term limit, whereas the same French that seem to be supporting Paul Biya, who stays more in Europe than in Cameroon, elected somebody that was less than 40. Emmanuel Macron was not 40 when he came to power. So I think very strongly that if we consider the respective happenings on the African continent, it seems, just as Collins has said, that the benefits to the people that are across the Atlantic will continue to make them push for those who will do their bidding. Because don't forget, many of those in opposition have attained a level of consciousness that have become radical, such that if persons in power are ousted, it will not favor them any longer. And I can tell you for free that until we realize that the agents of destabilization on the continent are those who come to the continent to preach peace and democracy, but they are really the enemies of the continent, who won't do much. Because don't forget, the dynamics of our economy essentially is still in their hands. So we have to be inside out in terms of revamping situation.
Collins, you know, the ugliness of this unwanted and unwarranted longevity doesn't end on the tables of politicking. Well, it snowballs into wars, conflicts, civil unrest, heated political climate, and much more. You were about, you know, giving us a recipe how we can actually get Africa out of this mess, because the more they stay in office, as enunciated by Adeniyi Kunnu, we just see more and more African countries getting into crisis.
Yes. When I get, you know, beautiful questions such as the one you have just posed, it makes me to reassess my position of indifference as regards, you know, term limit or no term limit. Now, if you put a gun to my head now and say to me, Collins, you've got to make a choice. And I don't have a gun. You can be rest assured that I'm actually going to gravitate scale. I believe it weighs more in favor of democracy than African, you know, future, at least, you know, in the developmental trajectory that we are in at this point in time. However, I'm not around, you know, all of that, because the individual is, you know, strong enough, and as long as, you know, the electorate is capable enough to make informed decisions, it is up to them to, either go for a much younger person or an older person. It doesn't really matter. Now, moving forward, in terms of solutions to all of it, I have to live and work in an environment where colonialism was a big issue, and the invisible hands of the powers that be here actually affecting Africa is very much there. But at this moment, we are dealing with millennials that are actually coming to power, and Generation X. They see things quite differently from the way their fathers and grandfathers saw things. And I tell you one thing, by way of, just a single example, the concept of national interest, I believe, is beginning to gradually be redefined. Because the moment national interest begins to get a broader definition than the narrow one that it currently enjoys, I think things will begin to change. Because right now, young people are beginning to understand that conflict in Nigeria, in Congo, in Uganda, and other African countries means that unrest will happen here. There will be refugees coming, illegal migration will happen, affect them, affect their social security system, and so on and so forth. So conflict in Africa, and supported by them through sales of arms and so on and so forth, is no longer a problem far from their bed. And that is that whole process of redefining, the concept of national interest. Another very important example, and if I have just a second, is the role of the AU. I believe that, like my colleague in the studio mentioned earlier on, the toothless bulldog approach that they had adopted up until now has got to start changing, because we know that there is a normative framework for stopping this whole undemocratic, power change in Africa, but they are yet to actually begin to implement it, to enforce it, to actually monitor it. I think the time has now come to begin to do all of that.
Gentlemen, I must let you both understand that on Village Square Africa, we don't usually exhaust a particular topic on an episode. So this conversation will continue tomorrow with both of you. We'll look at different perspective on this issue tomorrow, so that people on the continent understand what this is. Because leadership is the major key to opening the potentials of any people, and Africa will not be an exception. So African leaders must accept, as both of you opine, government offices, not retirement homes. They are for service, and people come in turns. So African leaders must learn to be, and it's important to the soul of democracy. So this is why I say many thanks for being such nice company, Adeniyi Kunnu, today, and of course, Collins Nweke. See both of you tomorrow. Is a deal, right? Great. Thank you very much. And don't forget to join us again tomorrow on the show.